All right, here we go. Welcome back. One bloke, one book from Perth. The Australian perspective. This week, we're reading Homicide by Martin Daly and Margot Wilson. Very interesting book. I got most of the way through it. And in it, they talk about homicide. Now, they discuss it from an evolutionary standpoint, which is different from how it's sometimes described in entertainment culture and popular culture and mainstream academia. So a lot of them discuss it in ways, psychological ways, where we're narrowing in on what it's like for the killer, for the offender, what was going on, what were the goings on in his mind, and what was arising inside him as he decided to take another man's life or whatever. It's all about motivation of the offender and motive for the killer and things like that. So this is from an evolutionary standpoint. Now, they discuss it in ways that are from a Darwinian perspective, and the baseline assumption that they're working with is that our goal is evolutionary fitness. How long can we survive? And the best way that we've learned to do that is to procreate, okay, is to have children. And that was Darwin's theory, and we've evolved in ways that have helped us achieve that end, evolutionary fitness, okay? So our self-interest arises insofar that we can survive, okay? And the best way to survive into the future is to have children. And we're quite good at it. Some of us are better at it than others, and some of us are not as good at it as others. And some of us are really bad at it, and those of us who are terrible at it no longer are around, okay? They're not alive anymore as a species. Or as a person. There are many people who didn't sire children who are now dead and never will. And those genes are gone. So, from an evolutionary standpoint, that's the baseline. Our goal is to survive. Now, how does that look from a homicide perspective? Well, one thought is if somebody's attacking me, then survival instinct is to, fight back and defend myself. And a consequence of that, or a corollary of that, is that it results in the death of the person who was attacking me. Okay, so that's one mode of survival. Now, in academic culture, in mainstream entertainment culture, discussing homicide, a lot of the claims being made are we kill relatives quite often. We're more likely to kill a relative, or relatives are more at danger. Because people who offend spend most of their time in the house, and if they have a family, they're more liable to take out their violence on them. So these two authors, they decided to investigate that claim, and they studied a range of homicides in Detroit, one city, from 1972 to 1983, I think, over a 10-year period. I'm pretty sure. It's in singular years as well. And the results are interesting. So half of the cohort of offendings, so half of the victims out of that cohort were not related to the offender, but they knew him in some way. Okay, so there was some acquaintance there. And out of the other half of that cohort were non-related, and didn't know the killer. Okay, the two parties didn't know each other at all. They weren't related. And the other half of that, they were related. So that's interesting. And now, out of that related cohort, a large portion of those homicides were the spouse and either the woman or the man. They were the spouse. They weren't consanguinal. Okay, they weren't blood related. Um, Large biggest portion. So it stands up the Darwinian theory that no, we don't actually kill people directly related to us. Um, by blood, genetically, we're more liable to harm people we don't know. And in a biological terms, a spouse is someone we don't know, because they're not genetically related to us. It needs to be that case in order to procreate, but in terms of homicide, they they're not related. So that's interesting. Now, a larger part of that cohort was men. So females were actually the killers. Um, and maybe some of you will know this intuitively, or maybe you won't, but that's because the male was generally abusive and it was in self-defense. But it's still classified as a homicide. Now, they weren't even investigating these cases a lot of the times around that time, and probably still today. It's like justifiable homicide or whatever you call it if the man's proven to be violent towards the woman or the children, then the woman's in her right to defend herself. So that's interesting. So the Darwinian standpoint holds up. We're more likely to kill people that aren't directly related to us, unless you're a baby, as it turns out. Babies are. Now, I should mention at this stage, I'm going to discuss these in ways that sound universal because they will be universal across all instances of the data that that they've studied in the book. But they're working with very small data sets, so we're talking about less than 1,000 homicides, in a city of somewhat million. So just bear that in mind. It's not as though this is like prevalent in society or anything. No, there's a very small cases. In Australia, it's, homicide has declined, I think, in the last 20 years. As a cursory look that I had the other day. So just remember that. So the largest person at risk of death is the child. And it doesn't talk about abortions, but that's to bracket that off. That's not what's being discussed here. Yes, that is a large part of death that we have in society now, and that's unfortunate and sad and not good. But we're talking about children who are actually born and then killed off. So, child is most at risk of death in its first 6 months of being born. Now, you might think it's strange. Why would anyone want to harm their infant? Or maybe you don't if you agree with the abortion laws, but let's just say you don't, and you think it's odd that any woman who would birth a child would want to harm her child, but that is a large part of the offenders in the cohort is the female. So they've studied some tribal cultures, non-Western cultures, in as a juxtaposition to the Western ones, and the figures are relatively similar, although there's more in the non-Western tribal cultures. Okay, so they studied one in India and I think one in New Guinea or Paraguay or something like that. River tribes and things like that they've studied, and infants are the largest at risk of death and in the first 6 months. So a lot of the times the child will be born and the mother will determine whether the child's worthy of being alive through in ways of like sickness and health and things like that. So if the child's not healthy, it'll be killed off. Um, females, females born, large part of them were females, they'll be killed off as well. Specifically because they're females in those tribal cultures, because the males are more desirable in those tribal societies. So that's interesting. Yeah, and that's been similar in historical periods as well. The male's always the one that gets prioritized, and we'll touch on why that might be the case soon. So infants are often killed due to sickness, due to gender, and interesting that might fly in the face of an evolutionary theory, because that, directly contradicts the theory, doesn't it? Well, you wouldn't kill your one chance of survival, especially in cultures that are more closely mapped onto the theory precisely, right? Because we'd argue that we were more evolved in modern societies, despite some of the laws being introduced. We more or less are a civilized society and more evolved. So that sort of homicide just wouldn't occur as much, you would hope, in today's Western society. But it does. And that's interesting, and it's due to those reasons. Now, so that flies in the face of Darwin theory, but what's interesting is that if one child already exists, an older child, and a younger one is born, the younger one will be killed off if it's deemed that having to nurture that younger child would impact the older child's potential in a negative way. So if the mother had to commit more resources and have to distribute both of those resources across both children, the younger one will be killed off if the older one isn't ready yet, or if it still needs the mother's resources. In fact, they couldn't find any cases, I think, bar one or two, where if it was a resource question, the older child was killed off in lieu of the younger one. It's always the younger one that gets killed off. And it's in protection of the older one for health reasons, resource reasons. So that's consistent with the evolutionary standpoint. You're putting more eggs into the basket you believe is going to be more capable of surviving. And the older the child gets, the less risk they have of being killed by the parents. The more investment the parent makes in the child's life. So that's interesting. Some of the children killed were from the father, and those were mostly due to questionability of the paternal heritage. Was he actually the father or not? That was documented in these tribal societies. So, super interesting. They'll kill siblings and younger children if they believe it will give their older ones a better chance of survival. They will kill their babies if they don't believe that the baby will survive, or if the baby is sickly in some way or deformed. Any measure or any indicator that the child may not be perfect in whatever ways that culture deems perfect to be, the child will be killed off and they'll try again. And the mother's usually the one that does it. So that's interesting. And that's across all of those tribal societies. In Western cultures, a little bit less, but still usually those not so much with gender until recently, but definitely health and sickness, deformity, that type of stuff. The parent will do the deed, will kill it off. So, from an evolutionary standpoint, it makes sense. We might not think that it's moral to do that, but those morals are built up of a Christian background that is not really the natural way of the world. The natural way of the world is brutal and unchanging, and one where parents kill children that aren't going to survive or they don't think will survive. That's the real way the world is, and we've just come in afterwards and started imposing morals onto it from the Christian standpoint, which has been beneficial for other reasons. So that's interesting to think about it that way, and it holds up based on the data. So that's interesting, I think. Infants will be killed off, and they usually kill them in brutal ways. So in one culture, the Kung San, the woman they'll go off to birth them on their own with a whole bunch of other women, and they'll build this little pit made of mud that's like a birthing circle, and they'll build a swing for the woman, and they won't grab the baby when she exits the womb during the accouchement. They'll let the baby drop because their term for birth means to fall. Can't remember the actual term, but means like to fall in this particular tribe. And so they let the baby fall, and they fall into this pit. And then they observe the baby before touching it, because once you've touched it, you've interacted with the baby and you've determined that the baby is good and right. So they'll observe it from afar before touching it and make sure that it hasn't got any deformities or defections or it's not sickly. They'll observe it for a little bit. If the child is sickly and deformed, they'll do the deed. And they'll generally do it with like a stick or something, and they'll bury it in the stand, and it'll either be killed by the stick or it'll suffocate in the sand or something. So quite brutal, quite unchanging, and that's in non-Western cultures. So that's interesting for a number of reasons. So they won't touch the child until they've deemed the child is worthy of being brought into the tribe, or if it's male. If it's male, it's got a better chance. And that's interesting. So there you go. Brutal and unchanging, and non-Western, and male. There you go. And it's usually the mother that kills it off. So similar with abortions, it's always the women that decide. That's the argument's being built. It's made the woman should be able to decide to kill her child. And there you go. There was a study done, if anyone's interested, in New Zealand, a longitudinal study that showed that females who committed abortion were far worse off by every available metric that we have of measuring a person's health. So they were physically less healthy, psychologically less healthy. More women who committed abortions turned to drugs and alcohol after they had done the deed, which is kind of sad. And statistically, the largest cohort of women to indulge in an abortion are Māori and Aboriginal and African American women. And so who are you really advocating for here? I wouldn't say you'd be able to advocate for women and the Indigenous at the same time, because if in your advocation for women you believe that abortion is morally permissible, then you will also concede that that woman will be worse off by every available metric during in having her right to choose, resulting in an abortion. And most of the women who commit abortions are Indigenous cultures, and so Indigenous cultures in their committing an abortion are worse off by every available metric. And that's what you're advocating for, if you're advocating for abortion in society. So good on you. You're racist. There you go. Little intellectual twister for you there. So that's interesting to think about. Um, so superstition's got a part to do with it as well in some of these Negro cultures. Um, if the child's not exhibiting features we've just mentioned, questionable heritage for the father, or in some cases because they're usually polygynous societies where men have multiple wives, if the man claims a woman as his trophy and she has children, offspring to another man previously, they'll be killed off. And it's just brutal. It's just crazy. The way that these cultures have, you know, adapted or how they are in their societies, and it's just different to how we organise ours. Better or worse, probably not the right way to describe it. Again, we've imposed those morals through our evolution of Christianity. So that's not the baseline. The baseline is brutal and unchanging, and men are completely violent to everyone. Females are not, and children are most at risk in society. As the baseline, that's generally how things work, and we saw that as well in our own society in early England, where a lot of the children were being killed off for similar reasons, very similar reasons, but there were some teething issues with regards to the law as well. So, in relation to homicide, plaintiff in the case of homicide used to be the family. So if someone was killed and it was proven that somebody else, a different offender, had done it, unrelated, then they could claim to the courts for compensation for the crime in the form of financial contribution or chattels of that person's property or something like that. And in relation to infanticide, a lot of the statistics were not being recorded because if you were a member of the family who killed your own infant, you would be, claiming compensation from yourself. It'd be a redundant exercise. So it wasn't until the state started claiming, they gave themselves the plaintiff. I don't know. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know the law terms for it, but they essentially made themselves the victim or the plaintiff in the case, that allowed them to claim property from the offender, which made infanticide a bigger issue as the industrial and legal institutions grew within England during the 13th and subsequent centuries. So that was interesting. Women also were motivated to kill off their young because women were less valued or couldn't, legally, again, the legal thing, they couldn't own property, could they? So they were sent off either to, if they couldn't find a husband, they were sent off to be a governess. And if they were pretty, presumably they were pretty, there would be, questions of, paternity amongst the household. And because let's be honest, we're the same as we've always been as a society, and there's only been a few of us that really uphold the Christian value. So most of us are just scoundrels and we'll sleep with whoever we can. And so, in the case of the woman back then, she was a governess in the house, she'd fall pregnant and she'd be fired from her job if she didn't, if she were to make claims about the father or such. And she couldn't do that because everyone was poor. So she'd kill the child. There were cases where some women, there were groups being formed where like gypsy type groups where the woman would claim to be a organization that tends for unwanted children, and in exchange for upfront financial contributions, they'd take the child away from the woman and care for it, but then kill the child. So that was a large part of infanticide as well. Um, so there were these whole groups being formed, and claiming children for financial contribution and then killing them off. So it's just crazy, some of the stuff that was happening. As the Industrial Revolution grew, women were being not forced, but they were given more opportunity to work in workhouses and different types of things. So, but because compensation was disproportionate to the resources required to survive, if the woman fell pregnant, and the husband or the father wasn't coming across, didn't want a bar of it, then she'd kill off the child. Now, again, these are very low socioeconomic type stories we're dealing with. They're not, most people of the richer class were not doing this. This was the baseline, which was people who are poor, which has historically been everyone, apart from a singular. It's only been very recently, in the last couple 100 years, that the most of us have become extremely wealthy. And some of you might not like that. Some of you might have a different theory about what wealth is. I would consider wealth being able to eat every day and being able to record a video and having all of this hardware. And, I've got a bookshelf full of books in my house, and, everyone owns property. And that's just crazy. It's unprecedented, in the West. And we know it's unprecedented because everywhere else that's not the West is still poor, aside from very few singular places that have capitalized on Western Industrial Revolution. So we've all just been poor historically, and poor people tend to die off and not prioritized, and, people's immediate survival is taken into account. And so the more likely victims are the people who are weaker. Weak men, women who are physically weaker, and children. And so infants are most at risk. They're most at risk, I mentioned this, in the first 6 months of birth, and then this is across all cultures that they've studied, and then their risk decreases as they get older. So that's interesting. Now, there are some other ways, some parasites, where the children will kill off the parents. Largest cohort is between the ages of 15 and 17, and they're men. So the men who are killing, and they're usually killing their fathers, not their mothers, and it's usually in defense of the mother. So that's in most cases. They're not crazy, they're just acting in self-defense of the mother. Freud would have something to say about that, I'm sure. But from an evolutionary perspective, it's just the child killing his father and in defense of the mother. So those are the most of the cases. They're same sex usually, and this is both ways. The father's most likely to kill a son, and the son's most likely to kill a father. Mother's most likely to kill a daughter. The daughter's most likely to kill a mother. Now, in the cohort where the daughters have killed the mothers, the average age for the daughter has been like 70. So the mother's been, 18 to 30 years older, should be closing in the end of their life. So there's some question over regards to euthanasia and things like that there. But that's interesting. So most of the, again, not a lot of it's premeditated. maybe some more in regards to that, with regards to the daughter killing her mother, but the the son, most of it will be spontaneous as a result of abuse in the family. So that's interesting to see it that way. It's intuitive. You probably know that. They're not, and it flies in the face of Freudian theory. It's not about sexual tension between the son and the mother. It's, as a result of abuse, where most of the cases have been recorded. So that's interesting. The other cases were. Oh, now I should mention it briefly with regards to the female being killed off. That's, happened in China historically with the one child rule. They value the male more. And these abortion laws in Australia have ignited a whole culture re-emerging of people aborting. People are migrating here because it's legal to abort your children now, so that they can abort women and select for men, which is just crazy. So why are men more, quote unquote, desirable from an evolutionary standpoint? Well, one of the claims they make in the book, out of all the people who are alive today, every one of them would have had a male and female parent. Okay? So the selection rate for females is 100%. Females are definitely going to have a child. Out of all the children in the world, parents are mothers. Let me try and just make sure I get this right. Out of every person who has a child, 100% will be the mother. The woman was 100% selective for rebirth because she's the one that carries the child and commits all the resources. Historically, not every male has sired children. In fact, more often than not, you can know this statistically because there have been more people alive throughout history than there are genetic differentiation. So more men have been alive than have had children. And in polygamous societies, men will claim multiple women. I think one of the ones they talk about is some Muslim dude, Uriel Ismail, who had 888 children. He's in the world record, and documented children, over 44 women or something. And so, a lot of these tribal cultures, it's the case that men will take multiple women, either concubines or wives. And a lot of them, because he was Muslim, he's only allowed 4 wives. So the rest had to be concubines. So that's crazy culture. And for every woman that a man claims as his own, that's another man that goes without. So it's more difficult for men. And from an evolutionary standpoint, in order to secure your offspring, you're selecting for men, which I think is interesting because I don't quite understand it myself. Because presumably, if the woman's 100% likely to have the child, well, wouldn't you just select for the woman? Doesn't make any sense to me, but maybe I've misread it. But that's in the book, so very interesting. And that's, the more men you have, the more likely they are to procreate with a woman, I guess, because they're hyper competing with other men for resources. And that's another reason that men kill each other, is because of women. Because generally, men are competing for resources, and it's those resources that culminate in violence, and women, don't forget, are one of the resources that men are competing for. Okay, the right to be with a woman. And the more violent the man is, the more desirable he is. The more likely he is of producing capable offspring, which is all the woman's thinking about. And that's just the way it is. So they're more likely to get women, and therefore they're competing with other men who aren't as violent, and the more violent ones win out. Most of the time. When it's been simulated, the people who survive win out regardless of how violent they are. But from a social standpoint, the more violent you are, or the more capable you are of dishing out violence, the more likely you are to be attractive to females. Now, it's interesting because our society doesn't select for violence anymore, it selects for intellect. So the hyper successful men are more conscientious and capable, and less violence. Not the right way to think about it. Their readiness to commit violence is less, or that their actual commitment to violence is less. Doesn't mean they're less violent. In fact, you probably find that most of the hyper productive men in society are probably got high levels of testosterone, but they're focusing that on work instead of, historically it would have been warfare. And so again, still desirable in that sense. So that's interesting. Now, male and male violence is the other one. So women are one of the resources competing. Now, status and honor also come into it. It's not seen technically as a status thing, but in some primitive cultures it is. But a lot of the killings that have occurred, a lot of the homicide, have been spontaneous, and what that means is the offender hasn't decided prior to the event that he was going to dish out the required violence necessary to kill a person. It's arisen as a result of the event that's occurred, which has caused him to commit that act. So, and one of the motivating reasons have been status and honor. Either the man has insulted him, his family, his wife, or he's infantilized him in front of his peers. And that's one of the main reasons. Now, again, this is low socioeconomic, low intellectual people who care about those sorts of stuff, and their readiness to commit violence and their commitment to violence is a lot higher than that. This is not, again, widespread in our society. Most men are capable of, not, I don't know why you'd be concerned if unless somebody's really being a fool and dishonoring you, but then they're probably low socioeconomic IQ as well, so it doesn't make any sense to me why you'd be offended. But that's what's occurring in a lot of these cases. Their honour has been soiled, sullied, and they're rectifying that with violence. And the violence is to the point where they take another man's life, where it results in the death of another person. Status and honour. Now, sometimes status and honour is prioritised in societies through violence, through murder. So a lot of these, again, non-Western societies that have been studied, there have been, you see this as well, and I'll just start with the cultures first, the non-Western cultures. They'll only let you into the warfare tribes, which are the high status tribes, if you kill another person. So a lot of them are often competing with who can kill people the quickest, and they're usually from different tribes. Again, not related, not genetically related. And you see this mapped onto gang initiations and things like that. where you're not initiated into the gang until you kill someone. So low socioeconomic, low IQ, that type of stuff. So that's interesting. It's interesting that would occur, and that still happens. But again, not as prevalent in the society as you might expect. So again, cohort's quite small. But out of all those cases, they're distributed in ways, whatever the data set shows, but they are quite a small number of cases. So what I've taken away from it, predominantly, is that in the data sets they've given, in their reviews of non-Western cultures, and in line with Darwinian theory, the world is extremely brutal towards everyone. There's a scarcity of resources, and we're all competing for them. And if I have resources, it means that somebody else doesn't, because there is a scarcity of resources. And so in these primitive cultures, that results in violence. And it can be towards relatives, it can be towards non-relatives, but more often than not, it's towards non-relatives, because we're more likely to prioritize the resources that we have. We're more likely to allocate those to our most closest relatives first, and then outwards. And we'll only kill off relatives, and by relatives I mean sanguinal relatives, co-sanguinal relatives, blood relatives, if we really don't have enough resources. So you don't even have to add religion into this. We're so good at allocating resources now, even though there's still a scarcity of resources, we're so good at allocating these resources amongst and distributing them amongst our societies through capitalism, that the violence has decreased, and there is a decrease in violence, except for the case of recently with all the immigrants coming in that are non-Western, that haven't adapted to industrialization, that are just still just brutal, living in hunter-gatherer type scenarios where they just want to hunt and kill everyone. So that's been interesting to observe with the immigration policies, that you only have to look out your street in Melbourne and there's people being slashed on the highways and all sorts of stuff. So it's just crazy. But from an evolutionary standpoint, we've just gotten so good at it, at distributing resources through capitalism, that there's less violence. And interesting that would be the case. And interesting that the Christian narrative would turn it on its head and say you allocate resources to your neighbour first rather than to yourself. So that's been the primary motivator for industrial incline, I think, was the distribution towards our fellow man instead of just to ourselves. So that's interesting to think about, if you think about that type of stuff. Otherwise, Homicide from an evolutionary standpoint, very interesting. Read the book. It's a good book. It's not that big. It's 270 pages. I got most of the way through it. I got to about 230, I think, before I needed to record the podcast. I'm getting most of the way through them. Next book I'm reading is called Fixing Broken Windows. Can't remember the author. Sitting on my bookshelf. So we'll read that next and we'll go through it. That's about crime as well. So there you go. It's a good book. Criticizes some of the social theories that you have, like some of the social sciences that are trying to dismiss or ignore biological empirical evidence. Like some of them, one of the anthropologists was saying that women can be just as violent as men, and she, Margaret Mead, her name was, and she had written a whole book about a culture that she'd supposedly observed where that was the case, and it was all bullshit. She'd never observed anything. So that's another one, fabricating evidence. So that was one of the things, and then that they found throughout all civilizations, they found male skeletons with extremely damaging skeletons made from multiple wounds in combat and fuck all on women. There's just not you don't. It's not comparable. The male is far more violent and brutal than the female. They're just not. The women aren't adapted to that sort of thing. They're not physically built for it, and they're not psychologically built for it. They're just not more violent, and they're far more weaker. They're not a threat. They're not a threat to us. We only compete amongst ourselves, and it's usually for them. So that's interesting to think about. So sorry, ladies, that's just the case. But unless you're desirable, in which case you'll have multiple men fighting over you. So that's good. So good on you. You're probably beautiful. There you go. So interesting to think about. So they critique a lot of social sciences like that try and dismiss biology. You can't. You have to, and even the Christians have to do that now as well. It has to stand up to empirical evidence. You can do that, but you just can't take you have to adapt your theories basically. And so the Christian theory has been adapted. The Christian narrative has been adapted to suit the evolutionary theory, and that's the one that I subscribe to. And that's all well and good. They can work side by side, and it's all good. But a lot of these fundamentalist fanatics that are dismissing biology can't be done. You have to you have to take it into account. It's that trying to think of the right word for it. It's that compelling. The evidence of the evolutionary standpoint, the Darwinian claim, it's that compelling. It really is that it really is that profound. It's a profound claim being made, and the evidence supports it. So as far as I can tell, I've read a few books related now to the evolutionary theory, including Darwin, and most of the evolutionary scientists who are also religious, they make a lot of sense. And it's logical and it's rational, and they're not guided by their emotions like a lot of the people in the social sciences are. So that's interesting. So there you go. There's the book, Homicide by Martin Daly and Margot Wilson. Read the book, enrich yourself like I have. That's all I do. I read the books and then I talk to you about it, and as best I can. There you go. Homicide. Next week we'll talk about Fixing Broken Windows by forget the author. Christ, what's his name? Forget. You'll see it next week. Until then, there you go. Thank you.